Story 1. The Left-Handed Pickpockets of London. London in the latter half of the 19th century was a city constantly in motion. Gas lamps flickered against soot-darkened brick, hansom cabs rattled over cobblestones, and the Thames carried both commerce and filth through its winding heart. Among this bustle thrived a criminal underworld less brutal than the murderers of Whitechapel, less flamboyant than jewel thieves, but no less feared by the ordinary working classes, the pickpockets. You might think of a pickpocket as a petty nuisance, a figure pulled from Dickens, a ragged boy trained under the eye of a Fagin, and in some ways that caricature wasn't wrong. Children were trained, pockets were dipped, and fortunes small though they were stolen on crowded streets. But what the Victorian press and police alike began to obsess over was not just the act of pickpocketing. It was the handedness of the thieves. The peculiar belief spread through London's newspapers that left-handed pickpockets were more dangerous, more cunning, and more difficult to catch than their right-handed counterparts. Where did this belief come from? Part of the answer lies in the biases of the age. Left-handedness was, in Victorian England, often seen as a mark of deviance. Schoolchildren were forced to switch hands, beaten or rapped with rulers until they conformed. To write with the left hand was not only awkward in a right-handed world, but was interpreted as sinister, literally so, for the Latin word sinister meant left. Against this backdrop, when constables arrested skilled pickpockets who happened to be left-handed, the detail became magnified into myth. The records of the Old Bailey from the 1860s and 1870s are scattered with references to these unusual criminals. You can read witness testimonies where a victim would swear, with certainty, that the thief's peculiar use of his left hand had startled them. Some described it as a reverse motion, the hand coming from an unexpected angle, slipping into waistcoats or handbags from the wrong direction, bypassing a victim's natural instinct to guard the dominant side. Detectives of Scotland Yard began to study this phenomenon closely. Charles Dickens, in his journalistic sketches, noted the fear of the clever-fingered, the left-handed dippers who seem to strike from shadows. And yet, what emerges from careful examination is not evidence of any superior criminal class, but rather a blending of superstition, prejudice, and coincidence, fanned into a moral panic by newspapers desperate for sales. Picture yourself on a foggy London street, jostled in a crowd leaving a theater. You are guarding your right side, where most people instinctively reach. Suddenly, a hand you never thought to watch slides from the left, taking your watch or purse. That psychological twist the crime committed against your expectations was enough to give rise to headlines branding left-handed pickpockets as the most unnatural of urban criminals. The Metropolitan Police, in their annual reports, began to quietly catalog such thieves. They were not many, just a few dozen names recurring across arrests, but their reputation grew, bolstered by court testimony and the retelling of officers at dinner tables. Soon, the very notion of left-handed criminality seeped into fiction, sermons, and lectures on morality. Guard your left side, mothers would tell children riding the crowded omnibuses. But beyond the superstition, there was method. These criminals learned quickly that exploiting expectations was their greatest weapon. They practiced in mirrors, trained themselves to reach and withdraw at unnatural angles. One infamous thief, known only as Southpaw Billy, was said to rehearse by dipping handkerchiefs from a clothesline blindfolded, switching hands until no one could predict his movement. Billy was eventually caught in 1872 after attempting to lift a silver pocket watch from a police inspector himself. But by then, the legend of the left-handed thief had already rooted itself in the public mind. So was there truly anything different about these pickpockets? Or had Victorian London simply found a convenient way to wrap prejudice in the cloak of criminality? To answer that, we have to look deeper, not only into individual cases like Billy's, but into the policing methods of the time. Because if the myth of the left-handed thief tells us anything, it's not about crime itself, but about how societies interpret and fear what they don't understand. And here, the story begins to bend. For as police tracked these supposed sinister criminals, they uncovered something stranger still. Networks of trainers, organized rings teaching children to reverse their instincts, entire schools of pickpocketing hidden in the alleys of Whitechapel and Clerkenwell. Were these truly schools for the left-handed, or were they simply part of a broader system of urban survival? That is where our investigation turns next. If the first hint of fear came from the unnatural movement of a left-handed hand in a right-handed world, then the true unease emerged when police followed those hands back to their origins. In the late 1860s, London was exploding not just in population, but in complexity. The city's East End, particularly districts like Whitechapel and Spitalfields, was a patchwork of immigration, poverty, and survival. Amid the soot-stained walls and rotting wood tenements lived thousands in conditions that were scarcely distinguishable from medieval slums. Here, charity could barely keep up with starvation, and a child who did not work often did not eat. In such a world, petty crime was not rebellion, it was necessity. Scotland Yard detectives, some newly promoted from beat constables, were tasked with identifying not just individual pickpockets, but the roots of organized thievery. In doing so, they stumbled across what they would come to call the alley schools. These were not schools in any formal sense. There were no blackboards or desks, no syllabi or instructors in academic robes. Instead, these schools were crumbling flats, locked basements, or abandoned storefronts repurposed as training grounds. The instructors, older thieves, some former street children themselves who had aged out of the art of pickpocketing and now profited by teaching it. What startled detectives most wasn't the existence of such places that was expected. What alarmed them was the specialization. One 1871 police raid on an address off Fashion Street revealed a shocking scene. 4 boys between the ages of 7 and 11 standing in a line, hands behind their backs, blindfolded. A man in his mid-30s, one William Clackett Penrose, stood behind a line of worn mannequins, each with jackets hanging loosely from the shoulders. The boys were reaching into the pockets of these jackets with their left hands only, their right hands bound at the wrist with twine. Penrose barked corrections, as if instructing piano scales. Constable Eli Barrage, who wrote a full report of the raid, noted the discipline and rigor with which the children moved, and described the entire operation as more orderly than the school at which my own child attends. Barrage's notes were later quoted in the Pall Mall Gazette, where the article was ominously titled "Left-Handed Delinquency in the Lower Boroughs." Penrose was arrested and charged, but not for training pickpockets. There was no law on the books that precisely forbade it. Instead, he was convicted on child cruelty charges, his sentence a mere 9 months in Newgate. By the time he was released, Penrose had become something of a folk hero in certain East End circles. Some said he resumed his instruction. Others claimed he moved to Liverpool to open a similar academy. The mythos of the left-handed pickpocket, once rooted in individual strangeness, was now tied to systems, small criminal ecosystems, where dexterity and deception were taught with purpose. And with the discovery of such schools came another revelation. There were whispered connections between these trainers and the broader pickpocketing gangs that worked London's theaters, docks, and train stations. One such network was the Weasers, a gang known for its emphasis on misdirection and illusion. The name came from their favorite technique. One member would suddenly begin coughing violently, wheezing, drawing attention, while another slipped purses or pocket watches away from distracted victims. The Weasers often recruited from the alley schools and were said to require left-hand training. Their leader, an enigmatic figure known only as Uncle Mark, was rumored to be ambidextrous, a rare trait that made him both a trainer and a field agent. The case that most vividly exposed this network was that of Josephine Oakes, a seamstress turned informer who came forward in 1873. Josephine had once dated a Weaser, a man named Linus Grady, and had accompanied him to several training locations in Mile End. Her testimony to Inspector Lewin revealed a layered system. Entry training. Children practiced with puppets and dummies, always tied to use the left hand first. Intermediate stage. They were sent into small crowds markets or charity lines with a senior watching. Successful attempts were rewarded with coin or food. Advanced level. Graduates of the academy were given new names and sent to locations like Victoria Station or the Lyceum Theatre to work in pairs. Oakes described the ideology of the gang as one of inversion, everything done backward, from the hand used to the angle of approach. It made them feel invisible, unpredictable, different. That psychological edge, she said, was constantly reinforced. They believed that being left-handed made them smarter than the rest of us, like foxes born with their feet already muddy. In response to this growing tide, the Metropolitan Police began developing more sophisticated surveillance techniques. Plainclothes officers, then a controversial innovation, were posted at high-traffic zones. Some were instructed to carry watches on their left side to test whether known suspects were targeting the less defended flank. Arrests increased, but so too did the sense of conspiracy. If left-handedness could be used to outwit even seasoned detectives, what else was being taught in those alleyway academies? The tension spilled into popular literature. Penny Dreadfuls featured villainous, left-handed child thieves working for shadowy masters. Moral reformers gave lectures with titles like The Crooked Hand of Crime. Teachers, already prone to punishing left-handed students, now had moral panic to back them. It wasn't just about pickpocketing anymore. Left-handedness was being criminalized by proxy. Yet not everyone bought into the hysteria. A few criminal psychologists, then a new and contested field, began speaking out, arguing that the panic was just that, a panic. Dr. Edwin Lonsdale, writing in the Journal of Metropolitan Criminology in 1874, proposed that left-handedness was not more prevalent among criminals, but merely more noticed. His paper concluded, "The criminal does not offend with his left hand more often, but we remember it more clearly when he does. This is not a matter of justice, but of bias cloaked as science." Nevertheless, perception shapes policy, and in the autumn of 1875, a memo circulated through the offices of Scotland Yard suggesting new guidelines for arrest reports. Officers were asked to note the handedness of every thief they processed. For the next decade, the left-handed box became a standard feature on the arrest forms for pickpockets. But if you're wondering whether this scrutiny stopped the rise of such criminals, the answer is no. It only drove them deeper underground. In the shadows of a city preoccupied with outward order, the alley schools adapted. They changed locations, rotated instructors, and began training in ambidexterity. A new generation was growing, one less interested in superstition and more concerned with results. What began as a curiosity was now a symbol of London's deeper anxieties. The handedness of a criminal had become a proxy for disorder, for disruption, for deviation from the norm. And yet, the real danger wasn't in the hand that stole. It was in the system that trained it, and the society that refused to see it coming. In the summer of 1876, the streets of London were buzzing not with excitement, but with unease. Several high-profile pickpocketing incidents had rattled the city's wealthier neighborhoods, particularly around the West End. At first glance, the crime seemed typical. A gold fob watch snatched near Piccadilly Circus, a purse lifted outside Covent Garden, a lady's brooch gone missing in Hyde Park. But these weren't random acts. They were precise, fast, and surgical. Every witness spoke of the same thing. The thief had used their left hand. This time, however, the authorities had an advantage. A low-level informant from the East End known only as Cabbage Nell had delivered a name to the police in exchange for the promise of leniency in her own theft charge. That name was Stephen Finn Mallory, a former Weezer, and by many accounts, one of the last truly dedicated left-hand specialists still operating within London. Finn Mallory was no boy. At 27, he had already served time in Pentonville and Clerkenwell for multiple thefts, and was known for disappearing for months at a time between jobs. He was a ghost, operating solo now, rumored to have trained briefly under Penrose himself during the early years of the alley schools. When he was finally cornered and arrested near the Limehouse docks, caught attempting to board a steamship under an assumed name, police discovered not just a man, but a ledger. In Mallory's small leather satchel was a hand-written notebook filled with diagrams of pocket angles, blind spots in human posture, and even drawings of coat types with notations like long drop, go left, reach inside, twist upward. It was a field manual, a curriculum born from the vanished alley schools and refined over years of practice. What it proved, above all, was that the left-handed techniques had not died, they had simply become more refined, passed hand to hand like trade secrets. The trial of Stephen Mallory, which began in November 1876 at the Old Bailey, was unlike anything the court had seen in a pickpocketing case. Normally, such crimes were handled quickly, often in under a day, with standard witness testimony and sentencing. But Mallory's case became a symbolic battle. The prosecution presented him not merely as a thief, but as the embodiment of an underground education, a living artifact of London's organized left-handed pickpocketing tradition. The judge allowed the notebook to be entered into evidence, and it caused a media sensation. The Times published excerpts under the headline, "The Anatomy of a Theft, Inside the Mind of a Sinister Hand." During the trial, multiple witnesses recounted how Mallory had used subtle misdirection, dropping coins, adjusting his hat, or fake stumbling into crowds to execute his thefts. One inspector testified that the notebook resembled more the notes of a criminal engineer than a petty thief. Mallory himself, when called to testify, declined to speak. He simply looked at the jury with the faintest trace of a smirk. After 3 days, he was found guilty on multiple counts of theft and sentenced to 6 years in Newgate Prison. But it wasn't the sentence that marked the end of the legend. It was what happened after. The unraveling of a myth. With Mallory behind bars and no new major arrests of left-handed thieves in the following year, something strange happened. The public began to forget. The press moved on. The sermons stopped. The criminal justice system, having overfocused on an attribute that had more to do with technique than true deviance, had exhausted the myth. Scotland Yard quietly removed the handedness field from its arrest forms by 1879. And the alley schools, they vanished as quickly as they had emerged. With stricter enforcement, social reformers moving into the East End, and newer crimes like fraud, counterfeiting, and organized gambling drawing police attention, the art of specialized pickpocketing fell out of fashion. Not gone entirely, but no longer the urban legend it once was. As for Stephen Mallory, he was released from prison in 1882 and disappeared entirely. No further arrests, no sightings. Some say he emigrated to Canada. Others believe he died in obscurity, his notebook surviving only in police archives. But what remained was the strange question that had haunted detectives for nearly 2 decades. Why did London become so obsessed with left-handed criminals in the first place? Perhaps it was fear of the unpredictable. In a world that valued order, rules, and routine, the idea of someone stealing from you in a way you hadn't anticipated, reaching from the wrong direction, struck a primal chord. The fear wasn't just of theft, it was of the inversion of norms. Dr. Lonsdale, who had spoken out against the hysteria years earlier, published a retrospective essay in 1885. In it, he wrote, "The left-handed pickpocket became a symbol of all we failed to understand about crime, that it adapts, that it outthinks, and that our prejudices often blind us more than the darkness ever could." Legacy and reflection. By the turn of the century, the entire episode had become a footnote in criminological history. New generations of police, trained in more systematic methods, barely mentioned the odd, left-handed scare of the 1870s. And yet, in the basements of criminal psychology departments, the case of the left-handed pickpockets is still occasionally taught not for its legal implications, but for what it revealed about how a city sees itself. Because what we fear says more about us than it does about the thing itself. And in Victorian London, for a time, the most dangerous thing imaginable wasn't a murderer or a gangster. It was a quiet, clever hand reaching from the wrong side. Story 2. The case of the railway ticket swindlers. It was a humid August evening in 1888 when a well-dressed man named Percy Hatherley boarded the 10:42 p.m. express from Euston Station. He wore a bowler hat tilted just slightly off-center, a pocket watch on a silver chain, and gloves of the softest kid leather. He was the very picture of Victorian respectability. He was also a thief. Hatherley didn't pick pockets, steal jewels, or break into homes. His crime was quieter, less obvious, and far more lucrative. He was part of a railway ticket fraud syndicate that, by the end of its run, had cost British rail companies an estimated £45,000 millions in today's money. Yet for decades, the case remained obscure, buried beneath headlines about Jack the Ripper and imperial wars. It never involved bloodshed or violence. It required no weapons. Just timing, charm, and an intricate knowledge of the British railway system. You might think of ticket fraud today as something minor, perhaps using a discounted pass you're not entitled to. But in Victorian England, the railway system was the lifeblood of commerce, communication, and social order. Trains transported not just goods and letters, but people across class lines and geographies. And as with any growing infrastructure, where there is a system, there is someone learning how to beat it. Hatherley was one of several men arrested in what the penny illustrated paper later called the Grand Rail Deception. But to understand the scale and audacity of the swindle, we must start years before the arrest, when the fraud had only just begun. The railway boom and the loopholes it created. In the 1860s and 1870s, the expansion of the railway system was exponential. Private companies competed to lay down lines, open new stations, and win lucrative contracts to carry the mail. But with expansion came chaos. Ticketing was not yet standardized across companies. Passengers traveling long distances often had to buy multiple tickets for connecting lines. Oversight was patchy. Station clerks, overworked and underpaid, could be easily distracted or bribed. Into this confusion stepped a small but sophisticated ring of con artists who realized that they didn't need to rob trains. They could simply manipulate the rules of travel. The method was almost elegant in its simplicity. Step 1. One of the swindlers would purchase a legitimate long-distance ticket, say, from London to Glasgow, but do so in cash and under a false name. He would carefully preserve the ticket, boarding the train but exiting at a smaller, unmonitored station early in the journey. Step 2. That same ticket, barely used, would be passed on to an associate, who would either resell it to another traveler or reuse it for an identical journey. In some cases, these tickets were doctored, the dates or destinations altered using special ink removers and new stamps. Step 3. In the most elaborate versions, forged exchange orders or first-class upgrades were introduced, documents that appeared to be authorized by railway supervisors, but were, in fact, entirely fake. At the center of this operation were a few key figures. Hatherley, of course, who handled much of the London End logistics, but also Algernon Meeks, a former ticket clerk turned forger, and Mrs. Eliza Carr, who was responsible for placing accomplices on trains to scout for vulnerabilities and build a ledger of guard shift schedules, ticket inspections, and known blind spots in travel routes. The brilliance of the scam wasn't in how it beat the system, it was in how it danced with it. The fraudsters didn't avoid the trains. They used them. They rode them, studied them, and wove their crimes through the very infrastructure that was supposed to catch them. Patterns emerge and eyes begin to turn. For years, the losses were attributed to clerical error. Rail companies simply wrote off small discrepancies. But by 1886, too many oddities had surfaced. Conductors on the London and Northwestern Railway reported encountering passengers with tickets that looked aged, despite being for same-day travel. A flurry of complaints emerged. Passengers denied boarding for tickets they claimed to have purchased honestly, only to find those same ticket numbers had already been logged as used the day before. The inconsistencies began to overlap. A Scottish inspector named Hamish Bell, working out of the Carlisle station, noted that multiple fraud cases involved transfers from London with unusually similar handwriting on the date revised stamps. Intrigued, he began collecting samples and found what no one had before: a repeating curve in the upper loop of the number 8, traced nearly identically on dozens of supposedly unique tickets. This small detail, a flourish of ink, was enough to raise suspicions. Bell forwarded his findings to investigators at Scotland Yard, who launched a quiet probe. They didn't announce their search, fearing the syndicate might scatter. Instead, they embedded plainclothes officers on long-distance routes and began compiling a list of recurring names and travel patterns. The turning point came in April 1888, when an inspector aboard the express from Manchester to London recognized a name, Mr. George Kettering, on a passenger's ticket that had supposedly been used the week prior. The ticket bore the familiar flourish in the 8. The inspector detained the man quietly and sent a wire ahead. When the train arrived at Euston, detectives were waiting. The man was George Kettering. He was Thomas Bright, a known associate of Algernon Meeks. Under questioning, Bright broke. He described a system of ticket exchanges carried out in cheap boarding houses, of drop-off points near Paddington, and of a rotating list of aliases that Hatherley and Meeks had been using for years. He led detectives to a small room above a tobacconist's shop on Haverstock Hill. Inside, they found dozens of altered tickets drying on a clothesline like currency in a printing press. A respectable face and a cracking facade. When detectives arrested Percy Hatherley in his rented Holborn flat, they were struck not by his criminality but by his civility. He offered them tea. He surrendered without protest. "You've done well," he allegedly told the constables. "I had thought we'd see Christmas first." Hatherley's home contained meticulous records of the scheme ledgers, route charts, even expense logs paying small sums to informants for inside information about ticket counter schedules. It was a criminal enterprise run with bureaucratic precision. The trial, which began in late 1888, was well attended but rarely sensational. The accused wore suits. The crimes involved no blood. The loss, though massive, had occurred through slips of paper and station platforms, not violence. But what gripped the public wasn't the scandal. It was the sophistication. In a time when most working-class families could barely afford train travel, here was a man profiting from its very structure. A man who had turned the country's prized infrastructure into his private revenue stream. Yet the deeper question remains: how many people really participated in the swindle, and did all of them get caught? Only 3 individuals were ever convicted, but dozens of names appeared in the confiscated ledgers, and multiple cities showed identical patterns of fraud in the following months. Was this a single ring or merely one branch of something much larger? That's where we turn next, into the mystery of the untried conspirators, the failures of prosecution, and the subtle art of criminal exit strategies in an age before digital footprints. By the time Percy Hatherley stood in the dock of the Central Criminal Court in 1888, the story of his railway ticket scam had captivated a select corner of the Victorian press. This wasn't a sensational crime. There were no mutilated bodies, no violent arrests, no desperate last-minute escapes. Instead, there was something quieter but more disturbing: a precise, procedural dismantling of trust in one of Britain's most admired institutions. And yet, even as the case against Hatherley, Meeks, and Carr was being laid out with painstaking detail, Detectives and legal observers alike were increasingly convinced of one thing: the real scope of the operation remained unknown. A crime of disappearance. There were names in the ledgers, at least 27 aliases that appeared repeatedly in ticket records seized from both Meeks' Forgery Flat and Hatherley's Holborn residence. Some of them matched existing rail customer complaints passengers who had been denied boarding for possessing used tickets. Others were traced to minor London boarding houses, where rent was paid in cash and no records were kept. Of those 27 names, only 3 real individuals were ever definitively identified. Thomas Bright, the informant who had led police to the forgery operation; a woman named Margaret Doyle, who allegedly ran a mail drop in Soho for Hatherley's altered tickets; and a man referred to only as Harris the Stamp. Harris, according to Meeks' later courtroom confession, was a former railway employee who provided authentic date and validation stamps, stolen during his brief stint working as a night clerk at King's Cross Station. But despite the police combing through employment records, no one matching the description was ever located. Harris, if he existed, had vanished like so many others involved. It became clear to Scotland Yard that what they had cracked wasn't a tight-knit gang, but one node in a loose, almost modular network. A criminal web whose strength lay in its decentralization. Individuals floated in and out, contributing skills, ticket alterations, stamp production, route surveillance, and then disappearing back into the fog of London's underclass. This wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern. The trial that was meant to last. The prosecution against Hatherley and his 2 associates lasted just over 6 weeks. Prosecutors had ticket samples, expert testimony from railway managers, and reams of handwritten notes showing the planning and distribution of forged tickets. Hatherley himself never denied involvement. In fact, according to courtroom transcripts, he seemed almost relieved. His defense, that the railway companies themselves had created the environment for fraud. Their fragmented systems, inconsistent inspections, and reliance on paper tickets had turned rail travel into a carnival of opportunity. The courtroom tittered when he compared the railway board to a sleeping gentleman with a heavy purse in his inner coat pocket, walking through a crowded market. But neither charm nor cynicism saved him. Hatherley received a sentence of 5 years hard labor. Meeks was given 7, owing to his role in producing forged documentation. Mrs. Eliza Carr, who had initially denied everything, later admitted to running ticket drops and tracking inspector rotations. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison, largely due to her secondary role in the scheme. It seemed on paper like a clean conclusion, but in reality, the trial raised more questions than it answered. The map that didn't match the territory. After the verdict, Inspector Bell, whose sharp eye for the number 8 had triggered the case's unraveling, was given special leave to conduct a retrospective review of travel fraud complaints over the previous decade. With assistance from junior clerks and retired railway inspectors, Bell combed through old ticket logs, passenger complaints, and station incident reports. He produced what he called the Red Line Map. This map, never published publicly, showed what Bell believed to be the actual scale of the ticket fraud operation. According to the records, over 112 confirmed fraudulent tickets were used between 1,883–1,888 that matched the same ink patterns, handwriting quirks, or stamping errors traced to the Meeks-Hatherley method. At least 9 different railway companies had been impacted. Of the 112 tickets, only 14 had matching passenger descriptions or witnesses who could identify those using them. The remaining 98 ghosts. Passengers who had bought their altered tickets from unknown sources, boarded trains, completed their travel, and disappeared. What disturbed Bell wasn't the scale of the fraud, it was the silence that surrounded it. There were no violent incidents, no confrontations. No one had come forward to say, "I bought this from a man in an alley." The passengers either didn't realize their tickets were fraudulent or they knew and didn't care. This implied something deeper, public complicity. Perhaps not conscious collaboration, but a kind of mutual shrugging off of rules when the opportunity arose. Unprosecuted and forgotten. Within a year of the trial, public interest waned. New scandals emerged. The Whitecapel murders returned to the headlines. Queen Victoria celebrated her Golden Jubilee, and in the margins of police archives, Hatherley's case slipped into footnote status. But for a few railway executives, it was not forgotten. The London and North Western Railway implemented a new system of ticket validation. In 1890, metal-etched serial numbers pressed into the card itself, making alterations significantly harder. Other companies followed suit. Ticket office design was modified so that stamping and issuing were always done in full view of customers and supervisors. A direct consequence of a crime that, until recently, few remembered at all. Yet not all consequences were structural. In a private letter written in 1892, preserved in the British Library's archives, a former inspector, William Cleves, wrote, "The men we jailed were only shadows of a bigger crime. Not a crime of theft, truly, but a slow, soft erosion. Like watching a single leak, knowing there's a dozen more behind the wall." Cleves had come to believe what many at Scotland Yard quietly admitted. Hatherley's syndicate was only one of several. His arrest had frightened the others into retirement or adaptation. Some theories suggest the fraud techniques were sold abroad. A small case in Belgium in 1893 mirrored the London methods almost exactly. A forgery ring in Paris used similar travel stamp modifications. Had the fraud evolved or simply migrated? Final reflections. As the railway fraud faded from public consciousness, it left behind one unspoken truth. The more sophisticated the system, the more invisible its cracks can become. It is not always the violent criminal who causes the greatest loss, but the clever one, the one who understands the rules better than the people who enforce them. And in the end, the story of the railway ticket swindlers wasn't a tale of brilliant crime or explosive scandal. It was about something quieter, more unsettling. A society that, when it looked at a well-dressed man with a valid ticket, never thought to ask where he got it. On the face of it, the trial of Percy Hatherley and his associates had been a success for the authorities. Convictions secured, a complex fraud ring exposed, and public confidence at least briefly restored in the British railway system. But those inside the Metropolitan Police and the Railway Executive Board knew otherwise. What they had cracked wasn't a singular crime. It was an entire economy of deceit, small, profitable, and disturbingly difficult to trace. By 1890, just 2 years after Hatherley's conviction, a quiet internal review at the London and North Western Railway showed that revenue losses due to fraudulent ticketing had dropped by only 12%. The implication was clear. The fraud had not stopped. It had changed form. An industry learns from its thieves. The immediate reform response to the Hatherley case was cosmetic. Updated ticket paper, modified stamping procedures, and rotating inspector schedules to disrupt the predictability exploited by Carr and Meeks. But even these improvements couldn't erase the fundamental flaw of the system. It was paper-based, human-reliant, and built on trust. The railways, until then, had operated on an assumption of good faith. Inspectors believed in passengers. Passengers believed in printed tickets. Clerks believed in schedules and stamps. Hatherley's scheme worked precisely because it exploited belief, never attacking the structure directly, but slipping between its seams. And for a brief time after the case closed, there was a strange silence. No dramatic copycat frauds. No bold attempts to replicate the Meeks-style alterations. Investigators assumed that the criminal class had either been frightened off or caught. But by 1891, a new pattern emerged. In cities like Birmingham, York, and even parts of Dublin, conductors began reporting passengers with valid tickets genuine to the eye, perfectly matched to rail records but purchased at steep discounts from anonymous vendors. When questioned, the passengers offered stories that all sounded remarkably similar. A man on the street selling unused tickets he no longer needed. In some versions, the sellers claimed to work for the railway company itself, offering staff-only discounts. The fraud had moved downstream. Rather than crafting forgeries, the new breed of swindlers purchased unused legitimate tickets from the poor or the desperate, often for pennies on the pound. These tickets were then resold at modest profits, often to unknowing buyers. This was fraud with plausible deniability. The buyer could claim ignorance. The seller disappeared before the first whistle blew. In its own way, this system was even harder to prosecute than Hatherley's. The man who never returned. As for Hatherley himself, his story ended not with a final twist, but with a disappearance. Released from prison in 1893, he filed no public statements, gave no interviews. There is no record of employment, marriage, or death under his real name. Some believe he left the country. Others think he changed identities, re-entered the underworld quietly, or perhaps even went straight. The last confirmed sighting was in a pub in Camden Town, where he was recognized by a former court reporter who said Hatherley appeared relaxed and well-fed, wearing a coat of high tailoring. Of Meeks and Carr, little is known. Meeks died in prison in 1891 of pneumonia. Carr was released early for good behavior and was rumored to have opened a small laundry business in Essex under a different name. But the legacy they left behind the idea that even the most regulated system could be undone, with quiet cleverness persisted. Public memory and selective forgetting. Unlike the bombastic crimes that filled tabloid memory, the railway ticket frauds faded from the cultural imagination. They never became penny dreadfuls. There were no wax figures at Madame Tussauds. No opera or stage play dramatized their deeds. And perhaps that's precisely why they're worth remembering. Because most crime is not dramatic. Most crime is small, methodical, repetitive. It happens in the folds of bureaucracy, in moments of distraction, in quiet exchanges at train platforms and street corners. Hatherley's story reminds us that criminal genius doesn't always look like genius. Sometimes it looks like a man in a good coat with a ticket he shouldn't have. A final glance at the tracks. Today, railway systems around the world rely on QR codes, GPS-tracked ticket validation, and digital surveillance to reduce fraud. And yet, even now, there are echoes of the Hatherley method. Scams involving fake discount sites, stolen e-tickets, and passengers gaming the system by splitting fare zones. In 2019, a rail passenger in the UK was fined nearly £12,000 for long-term fare evasion, using a modern variation of Hatherley's technique, boarding trains with partial tickets and evading inspectors with timing and misdirection. The tools change. The principle stays the same. Where there is trust, there is opportunity. Where there is opportunity, someone is watching. And somewhere, someone is boarding a train with a valid ticket. That was never truly theirs. Story 3. The Great Umbrella Thefts. When you picture Victorian crime, perhaps you imagine foggy alleys, blood-stained cobblestones, or the clatter of boots as police chase a fleeing suspect. But beneath these sensational images lay a subtler, stranger undercurrent of criminal activity, one so ordinary that most people never questioned it until it was too late. Umbrellas. Yes, umbrellas. In the London of the late 19th century, an umbrella wasn't merely a weather shield. It was a status symbol, a necessary tool, and often an unexpected liability. Because during a span of nearly 15 years from approximately 1875 to 1890, the city saw a peculiar surge in umbrella thefts so pervasive. It birthed not just individual crimes, but an entire black market industry. So much so, in fact, that one newspaper in 1882 referred to London's umbrella economy as the most civilized theft epidemic the city has ever endured. At the center of it all was a man known only by a moniker, Mr. Ivory Handle. The curious case of ordinary theft. Unlike a watch or necklace, an umbrella was not always seen as personal property in the strictest legal sense, at least, not when left in a hallway, a stand, or a club cloakroom. Ownership could become vague. Umbrellas were commonly mistaken, borrowed without permission, or accidentally taken in a rush. This ambiguity became the perfect cover for a criminal network. What began as opportunistic pilfering, swapping a broken umbrella for a finer one in a train station vestibule, evolved into an enterprise. It was systematic, organized, quiet, a kind of reverse industrial theft, where instead of stealing valuables from factories, the thieves targeted the products of industrialization themselves: umbrellas, hats, gloves. The simplicity was almost disarming. An umbrella, especially a gentleman's model with silver ferrule and ivory handle, could cost the equivalent of 2 or 3 weeks' wages. And they were everywhere, hanging in church entrances, drying outside pubs, packed into crowded theater cloakrooms. In 1878, a letter to the editor of the Morning Post warned, "Sir, I have had no fewer than 4 umbrellas removed from the Royal Academy cloakroom this season, each finer than the last, and yet never recovered. It seems some rogue has learned to profit where the police cannot trace." This rogue was not alone. The gentleman thief, or something more. In 1880, London's West End began whispering about a sharply dressed man with an easy smile, seen often at club entrances, art salons, and auction houses. He never appeared to be in a rush, always carried a fine umbrella even on dry days, and had a particular fascination with left-behind property. Witnesses often described him as helpful, occasionally even seen handing umbrellas back to forgetful patrons. But over time, more and more people noticed the same thing. Whenever he was present, an umbrella went missing. This figure, never formally identified, was nicknamed Mr. Ivory Handle due to his signature accessory, a rare white-handled umbrella thought to be custom-made. He was suave, often unnoticed, and utterly untraceable. By the time investigators began to take the theft seriously, dozens, perhaps hundreds of umbrellas had been reported missing across the city's wealthier districts. But what truly caught the eye of Scotland Yard wasn't the frequency. It was where the stolen umbrellas were turning up. The pawnshop circuit. Between 1877 and 1885, umbrella shops along Tottenham Court Road began to receive second-hand stock from pawnbrokers' umbrellas of unusual quality and construction. A few had initials engraved. One even had a coat of arms etched beneath the handle varnish. These were not generic accessories. They had owners. Inspector Miles Cartwright, working in the Property Crimes Division, began cross-referencing umbrella pawn slips with reported thefts and complaints. He quickly realized something strange. Most of the pawns had occurred within a 5-mile radius of St. Martin's Lane, and nearly all within 48 hours of the original loss. A pattern was forming. In many cases, the thief never even altered the umbrella. There was no need. Pawnshop owners rarely asked questions, especially if the item was common, functional, and easily resold. In January 1883, Cartwright conducted an unannounced sweep of 12 pawnshops in Soho and Bloomsbury. He seized 34 umbrellas, of which 17 were linked directly to known theft complaints. But who had brought them in? Pawnbrokers described multiple individuals, men and women alike, each providing fake names and vague backstories. Some claimed the umbrella had belonged to a deceased uncle. Others claimed they had received it as a gift. The variety of stories meant only one thing: this was no lone thief. This was a ring. The economics of the everyday. By mid-1884, The Metropolitan Police suspected the existence of what one detective called an umbrella laundering syndicate. Their hypothesis: thieves, perhaps part-time or freelance, stole umbrellas from public spaces and funneled them through a small network of trusted pawnbrokers or resellers. In some cases, umbrellas were cleaned, polished, or even upgraded before being resold. The most expensive models, often gentlemen's umbrellas with carved handles, could sell for half their original price, no questions asked. One key case involved a woman named Miriam Keene, arrested in 1885 for attempting to pawn an umbrella reported stolen from the lobby of the Savoy Hotel. When questioned, she claimed to be only delivering the item on behalf of a man she'd met at a church service. That man, of course, was never found. She admitted something more interesting. She had made 2 shillings per umbrella for each delivery, no matter the value. She did not steal them, she merely moved them. Police began to suspect there were dozens of others like her runners paid small fees to act as buffers between the actual thief and the resale point. It was smart, elegant, even. The deeper they dug, the clearer the structure became. Thieves, freelancers, mostly operating in train stations, theaters, and clubs. Collectors, intermediaries who paid the thieves a flat rate and gathered umbrellas en masse. Cleaners, quiet shops or private homes where umbrellas were wiped down, labels removed, or initials burned off. Runners, often young women or elderly men who delivered items to pawn shops. Resellers, umbrella dealers or brokers who offloaded the items as second-hand goods. And always behind the curtain, whispers of Mr. Ivory Handle, the ghost figure allegedly pulling the strings. But no one ever saw him twice. So the question becomes, was Mr. Ivory Handle real, or simply a myth created by those who preferred mystery over the banality of organized petty theft? By 1885, the Metropolitan Police had a problem they were reluctant to admit in public. They were being outmaneuvered by umbrella thieves. Not because the thieves were especially dangerous, there were no knife fights or forced entries. Not because the stolen goods were rare jewels or art. No, the problem was that the crime was too ordinary, the stolen items too ubiquitous, too interchangeable, too unglamorous for serious judicial attention. And yet the value lost was staggering. One internal report from Scotland Yard estimated that over 4,000 umbrellas were stolen in London annually. Many were never reported. People blamed themselves or chalked it up to forgetfulness. But for those tracking the black market circulation of these items, the thefts represented not just lost property, but a new form of criminal economy built on plausible deniability. So the police did something they rarely did in petty theft cases. They went undercover. Operation Black Brawley. Spearheaded by Inspector Miles Cartwright and Sergeant Henrietta Brand, Operation Black Brawley began in the spring of 1886 as an experimental surveillance effort. The idea was simple: stage valuable umbrellas in high-traffic public venues, monitor them with plainclothes officers, track anyone who took, moved, or attempted to sell them. Initial efforts failed. Many planted umbrellas remained untouched for hours, and when they were taken, the perpetrators often vanished into crowds before officers could follow. But Brand, one of the first female investigators working with the Yard in unofficial capacity, suggested a more targeted approach. Instead of placing umbrellas randomly, they would bait specific locations, places where umbrella thefts had become routine. The reading room of the British Museum, private cloakrooms in gentlemen's clubs, the cafe at the Royal Academy. In June 1886, a trap was laid at the Burlington Arcade. A silk umbrella with a polished bone handle engraved with a fake set of initials was left behind on purpose in the cloakroom of a small private gallery. Within 40 minutes, it was gone. 3 days later, the same umbrella turned up at H. Perrow & Sons, a pawn shop in Clerkenwell. The ticket was traced to one Albert Franks, a former bootblack with minor priors for loitering. He'd been paid fourpence by a man to drop off an umbrella. The description of the man was frustratingly vague. Tallish, fancy coat, looked like a lawyer. Franks, under questioning, provided a curious detail. The man had given him a calling card, supposedly so Franks could receive payment later. The card read, "Mr. I Handle, supplier of fine weather apparatus. What is borrowed is better than what is owned." It seemed ridiculous, surely a joke, but Cartwright and Bram were stunned. For the first time, Mr. Ivory Handle wasn't just a nickname whispered through tea-room gossip. He'd left a calling card, a crime that wasn't quite illegal. As Operation Black Brolly ramped up, more pawnshop tickets were recovered, more umbrellas reclaimed, and more runners like Franks were detained. But there was a growing legal complication. Most of the crimes were legally ambiguous. In many cases, the umbrellas weren't stolen. In the legal sense, they had been left unattended in public spaces, and the thief simply forgot to return them. It was hard to prove intent to steal, especially if the person selling or pawning the item claimed they had simply found it. Even when theft could be shown, courts were reluctant to issue harsh punishments. Magistrates regularly gave out light sentences, a few weeks in jail or a small fine. This only emboldened the operation. In one memorable case, Mrs. Lillian Shore, a 62-year-old woman arrested for pawning 8 umbrellas over the course of 4 months, admitted that she received them from a man who always met me at the same lamppost near Oxford Circus. She described him as always clean, quite tall, with a habit of tapping his umbrella twice on the ground before speaking. She couldn't give his name, but the description matched 3 others, different genders, different neighborhoods, same details. Someone was coordinating the operation, but despite months of effort, police never caught the person at the top. The umbrella economy persisted. The culture of the brolly. What made umbrella theft so difficult to eradicate was its social camouflage. Everyone had an umbrella. Everyone lost one. Everyone borrowed one. The items changed hands so frequently that ownership itself became fuzzy. In one editorial published in the Illustrated London News in 1887, the author wrote, "There are but 2 kinds of Londoners, those who have had their umbrella taken, and those who have accidentally taken someone else's." The ambiguity created a moral gray area. Was it truly theft if you picked up an umbrella identical to yours in a church vestibule? Was it wrong to pawn an umbrella you found when you yourself had lost 2 in the past year? This normalization of petty theft was, in fact, the operation's greatest defense. Fatting reign, fatting legend. By 1889, thefts declined not due to a wave of arrests, but due to cultural and technological shifts. Umbrella tokens, small brass discs with engraved initials, became popular, making it easier to identify one's umbrella. Private clubs and museums began locking umbrella stands, or requiring coat check attendants to issue numbered slips. Most importantly, mass production reduced the price of quality umbrellas, making them less of a high-stakes item to steal. As umbrellas became cheaper and more disposable, the black market dried up. Resale prices plummeted. Even pawnbrokers lost interest. By 1892, Operation Black Brolly was officially closed. No central figure, no Mr. Ivory Handle, was ever caught. Some believe he never existed. Others argue he was many people, using the persona like a badge or signature and identity, passed among middlemen and collectors like a theater mask. But what remained was the oddity of it all. An entire city, once quietly tormented by the theft of umbrellas. A crime wave that left no blood, but drained 1,000 pockets. A criminal legend built not on violence, but on manners and misdirection. By 1890, London had changed. The city was cleaner, thanks to sanitation reforms. Its police force was more professional, thanks to administrative overhauls after the failures surrounding the Ripper cases. And in parlors and papers, a quiet curiosity had faded. Umbrellas had stopped vanishing. Or more accurately, they stopped mattering. The umbrella theft epidemic that once dominated whispers in gentlemen's clubs and fueled speculation across newsprint had ended not with a raid or a trial, but with something far more mundane: irrelevance. This is the story of how a criminal empire collapsed not because it was exposed, but because it was outpaced by modernity. The decline of value. In the early 1880s, a high-quality gentleman's umbrella was a prized possession, often bespoke, featuring whalebone ribs, carved ivory handles, and tightly rolled silk canopies. A single umbrella could cost the modern equivalent of £300 400. Thieves didn't need to fence stolen goods in dark alleys. They only needed to walk it into a pawn shop. But by the dawn of the 1890s, mass manufacturing had changed everything. The import of cheaper steel ribs from Germany made frames sturdier but cheaper to produce. New textile mills in the north began producing inexpensive waterproof fabrics that mimicked silk. Faux ivory and wood-stained handles replaced expensive hand-carved ones. Most critically, department stores like Whiteley's and Harrods began selling umbrellas in bulk, offering quality at prices even clerks could afford. As prices dropped, so did risk tolerance for thieves. Why steal an umbrella worth £1 when a clean version could be purchased for 10 shillings? Why operate a laundering circuit when demand for second-hand brallas had all but vanished? Pawnshop owners, once willing collaborators, stopped taking umbrellas altogether. It simply wasn't worth the risk. The final investigation. In 1891, one of the last official documents related to the umbrella syndicate was filed quietly at Scotland Yard, a memorandum from Inspector Miles Cartwright. In it, he noted, "There is no longer value in pursuit. Of those we detained, few ever named a central coordinator. Most names we gathered were aliases. Runners have vanished into the general population. The pattern has dissolved." He added a curious postscript. Received a final tip from a Kensington vendor claimed to have seen the man with the white handle selling umbrellas from a barrow cart near Hyde Park. If true, then our gentleman thief now sells what he once stole. The irony was not lost on Cartwright. Perhaps the mysterious Mr. Ivory Handle, if he ever existed, had adapted like any good capitalist trading theft for retail. Crime in the margins. While the great crimes of the era, the Crippen poisoning, the Ripper murders, the political bombings loom large in Victorian memory, the umbrella thefts are barely remembered. You won't find wax mannequins of umbrella thieves in museums. There are no crime novels inspired by pawnshop middlemen who laundered umbrellas through Soho's alleys. And yet, in many ways, this case reveals more about how crime works than the bloodier tailies ever could. It was economic. It was organized. It was hidden in plain sight. And most importantly, it ended not through justice but through change. The world moved forward, and the crime lost its footing. Legacy in ink and irony. Even in its twilight, the umbrella economy left traces. A short play performed in 1894 at the Gaiety Theatre satirized London's obsession with misplaced umbrellas. A character named Mr. Ivor H. Handle delivers a monologue about how he has taken only what the weather owed him. That same year, a humorist writing for Punch penned a satirical letter to the editor. "Dear Sir, I wish to confess that over the course of my life, I have acquired through various means no fewer than 57 umbrellas. I bought only one. Am I a villain or merely a Londoner? Yours ever dry." Reflections from a stand. In today's world, The idea of a city under siege from umbrella theft sounds absurd, almost quaint. But in the quiet urgency of the 1880s, these thefts weren't funny. They were invasive. An attack not on life or limb, but on the assumption that something left by the door would still be there when you returned. And in that breach of trust, there lies the essence of most crime: not violence, not evil, but opportunity realized, consequences evaded. That's what Mr. Ivory Handle understood. That's what made him dangerous. And that's why, though never caught, he was never quite forgotten either. Story 4. Mysterious Death at the Tea Shop. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon in the spring of 1896 when Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, a widow of modest means, stopped in for her usual at Branwell's tea shop on Lupin Street. She ordered the same thing she always did: Darjeeling tea, a cherry scone, and a corner seat by the lace-curtained window. She had finished most of her meal when she collapsed to the floor, convulsing, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. She died before the doctor arrived. At first, her death was believed to be a tragic but unremarkable event. A woman of 62 years, perhaps suffering from heart trouble, had simply expired over tea. But something about the scene unsettled Constable Whitlow, the first officer on site. He noted in his report that Mrs. Pritchard's teacup remained half full, untouched. The scone, on the other hand, had been eaten almost entirely except for the last bite, which was carefully tucked into the linen napkin in her lap. The attending doctor marked the cause as suspected poisoning. Within 2 weeks, a second incident occurred. This time, a bank clerk named Douglas Fry, just 27 years old, collapsed after ordering a buttered crumpet and a pot of assam at the same establishment. He survived, but only barely. When questioned, he remembered a strange, bitter aftertaste in the crumpet. His diagnosis confirmed it: arsenic. Branwell's Tea Shop, a quiet, family-run shop with embroidered menus and elderly clientele, was shuttered by order of the police. And the investigation that followed would unravel one of the oddest poisonings in London history, not for its cruelty, but for how quiet, deliberate, and nearly untraceable it had been. Tea, trust, and unthinkable crimes. In Victorian London, tea shops were seen as safe spaces, especially for women. They were respectable alternatives to the pub, free of smoke and rowdy behavior. Women could dine alone without attracting scandal, discuss domestic matters, or simply rest with a pot of Earl Grey and a slice of sponge cake. That's what made the deaths at Branwell's so unsettling. They represented not just tragedy, but a betrayal of trust in a place designed for peace. And worse, the poison had entered through the pastries. The first chemical analysis, conducted on the remnants of Mrs. Pritchard's uneaten scone, confirmed the presence of arsenic. Not a massive dose, just enough to go unnoticed in flavor, but fatal over time. Investigators believe she may have visited the shop several times in the prior weeks, and that the arsenic may have been administered in gradual, sublethal doses until the day it finally overcame her. Was this a targeted killing, or something stranger? A peculiar pattern emerges. Detective Inspector Leopold Gray, known for his work on petty fraud and food adulteration cases, was assigned to the inquiry. His first act was to examine Branwell's staff, a husband and wife team in their 50s, 2 teenage dishwashers, and 1 baker, the only outsider, Miss Cecily Morvan, aged 34, a reserved woman from Surrey who had joined the shop 9 months prior. None had prior convictions. The shop's books were clean. The Morvans' owners, Edward and Letitia, had run Branwell's for nearly 12 years without incident. But Gray's next move was more unconventional. He requested customer logs, not receipts, those were rarely kept, but informal notes Mrs. Morvan had been keeping in a small brown ledger near the till. It included rough sketches of popular orders, day-of-week attendance, and even small notations about customers. Among the scribbles were peculiar remarks. Mrs. P. Cherry scone, 2x/WK, asks for left side crust. Fry, always polite, Watches front window often, never eats lemon things. Yellow girl doesn't pay, but leaves coins on windowsill. It was more than a log. It was an observation journal. Gray suspected that the person who had been recording such detail about customers might either be the killer or close enough to them to have known something. Miss Morvan, when asked, admitted she had kept the notebook to pass time. She called it a habit from her time working as a governess. You learn to notice things, she said. That's all it is. But Gray remained unconvinced, especially when the lab returned its findings. The arsenic had not been in the tea or butter, but within the scone dough itself. Poison in the pantry. The police immediately searched the bakery's storeroom. Inside they found flour, dried fruits, sugar, and a small tin of cream of tartar which, on closer inspection, tested positive for a powdered arsenic compound. It had been repackaged, unmarked. The Morvans insisted the ingredients had come from their usual supplier, but Miss Morvan, the baker, denied using cream of tartar in the scones at all. I never need it, she told police. Our flour is strong enough. Pressed further, she confessed. She had no idea how that tin got there. It was a troubling answer, too passive for someone so precise in her notes, yet also plausible. The kitchen, during peak hours, was often shared. Ingredients were moved, borrowed, but only one person made the scones. Cecily Morvan. Was she a killer, a scapegoat, or something in between? The third bite. As Gray expanded his inquiry, he quietly placed surveillance on St. James' Tea Shop, across the Thames. A former Branwell's employee had begun working there, and within days, a regular customer reported a burning sensation after eating a ginger biscuit. The police rushed in. No poison was found. The incident was dismissed as coincidence, but in the chaos, Gray made a quiet discovery. Miss Morvan had once applied to St. James, but had been turned down. This raised a new possibility. Was this not personal murder at all? Could it have been a kind of professional sabotage, a war between rival bakers, fought with invisible weapons? That theory, while salacious, quickly collapsed. St. James had received no poisoned goods, and their head baker had no known grudge with anyone at Branwell. No, the answer had to be closer, more private, more intimate. So the question remains, was the poison ever meant for Alina Pritchard? Or was she merely the unlucky recipient of a wider, deadlier plan still unfolding? Detective Inspector Leopold Gray was not a man prone to romantic thinking. He had worked in the grim corners of London's justice system long enough to know that most crimes were born from predictability, debt, jealousy, desperation. But this case, it disturbed him for a reason he couldn't yet articulate. The poisonings at Branwell's were not typical. There was no clear motive, no open conflict, no inheritance, no triangle of lovers. Instead, the case offered him what he called the slow drip of dread. When Mrs. Alina Pritchard died, it could have been called a fluke. When Douglas Fry barely survived a scone, it raised alarm. But it was Gray's methodical cross-checking of previous ambulance callouts to Branwell's stretching back 11 months that revealed a chilling trend. There had been at least 7 prior incidents where customers reported symptoms consistent with arsenic exposure: nausea, fainting, vision issues, and stomach cramps. All had been dismissed as heat stroke, poor digestion, or fainting spells due to overexertion. But the locations matched. So did the items consumed, pastries, always pastries. The shadow ledger. Using Miss Morvan's personal observation notebook, Gray went back to each of the reported incidents. A pattern emerged, not in the victims but in the way the food had been served. Most of the poisoned items were scones or shortcakes, often prepared on quiet mornings when Miss Morvan was not scheduled to bake alone. Gray had initially assumed that if Morvan were guilty, she would have used her private time to add arsenic. But instead, the pattern suggested the opposite. Poisoned pastries occurred when she was not alone, when another staff member had access to the prep station. specifically on days when Letitia Morvan, the co-owner and manager, had covered the kitchen due to Cecily headaches. Gray, who had initially dismissed Letitia as a proper, maternal figure with no criminal record and no known motive, now began to reassess her entirely. He returned to Branwell's now closed, but still in police custody, and requested permission to search the office at the back of the building. Behind a ledger drawer, he found something that had not been cataloged in the initial search: a folded letter, postmarked 2 years earlier, addressed not to the shop but to Letitia herself. It was a single sheet of parchment in a man's hand, signed only with an initial, T. You are owed better than your lot. You should never have been left holding that little business with him. He made a fool of you. You do what you must. Remember, some poisons are slower than others. There was no envelope, no full name, no admission of crime, but the implications were devastating. Letitia's husband Edward, the co-owner of Branwell, had once been suspected of infidelity with a younger customer, rumors whispered in local newsletters, never confirmed. He had fallen ill 3 years prior with what had been diagnosed as a digestive disorder. He survived, but the marriage had never recovered. Was this letter a bitter encouragement from a confidant, or something darker? The fingerprints on the tin. Back in the lab, Gray had the arsenic-tainted cream of tartar tin re-examined, using a new method adopted from German chemical forensics, a fingerprint transfer via mercury vapors. The results were surprising. There were 2 clear fingerprints. One belonged to Cecily Morvan, the baker as expected. The other, Letitia Morvan. Not on the outside of the tin, on the inside of the lid. Letitia had opened it, possibly refilled it, but why would she do so if she were simply managing the shop? Gray confronted her days later at her residence in Kentish Town, where she had moved after the shop's closure. She offered tea. He declined. She denied everything, said she had merely tidied the pantry one day when Cecily was out sick. As for the letter, from an old school friend, she claimed, nothing more. Gray left without arresting her. There wasn't enough for a charge, but he was certain now Letitia had been involved, perhaps not in all the poisonings but in some, and most chillingly, she may not have acted alone. A baker's silence. When informed that Letitia's fingerprints were found in the poisoned tin, Cecily Morvan did not respond immediately. Instead, she asked for pen and paper. She wrote a full-page statement that read more like a confession of complicity than guilt. In it, she described months of quiet dread, scones she didn't remember baking, orders altered after she had left the kitchen, a suspicion that she could not voice because to accuse Letitia would mean accusing the only person who had ever given her stable work. I feared that the kitchen was haunted not by a ghost, but by someone who believed they were doing what was right. Cecily never formally accused Letitia, but her words were damning. And then, in an unexpected move, she left the city entirely. A note to the police declared she would not testify. No forwarding address was provided. So we are left with this: a respected woman who may have used poison not to kill strangers, but to create a smokescreen for an older crime. A baker who saw the signs, but could not or would not speak. And a string of accidental illnesses that the courts never prosecuted. Letitia Morvan was never charged. Branwell never reopened. And Alina Pritchard's name became just one more in a long list of unexplained deaths in a city that had grown used to mystery. But the question remains: was Mrs. Pritchard the true target or merely a casualty in a crime so personal? Its message was whispered not in words, but in flour, fruit, and folded napkins. In the years that followed the closure of Branwell's tea shop, no further poisonings were reported on Lupin Street. The lace-curtained storefront was eventually sold to a tailor's apprentice, and later became a print shop. Yet, for those who remembered the deaths of Mrs. Alina Pritchard and the near-fatal illness of Douglas Fry, the case never really closed. No arrests were made, no one was charged, and in many ways that was the most disturbing part. Because everyone involved, the detectives, the victims' families, the shop's patrons, suspected they knew who was responsible. They just couldn't prove it. The legal fog. In 1897, 1 year after the final investigation ended, Detective Gray submitted his formal report to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. It was a dense document, filled with witness statements, lab results, handwriting analysis, and speculative connections. But in his concluding summary, Gray wrote, "There exists a convergence of circumstantial indicators against Mrs. Letitia Morvan that would, under other conditions, justify a formal charge. However, the absence of direct physical evidence tying her to the administration of poison and the refusal of the primary witness, Miss Cecily Morvan, to testify render prosecution untenable." It was a delicate way of saying what everyone already knew. Letitia had outlived the case. Without a living, cooperative witness or hard proof of intent, she was beyond reach. And Cecily Morvan, the only person who might have known the full story, had disappeared entirely. Echoes in other cities. 6 months after Branwell's closed, a similar case surfaced in Bath. A gentleman fell violently ill after eating a cream tart at a small tea shop. Trace amounts of a chemical compound similar to arsenic were detected in the custard filling, but no arrests were made. Then, in Liverpool, a confectionery stall was shut down after 3 customers reported vision disturbances and vomiting. Again, traces of arsenic were found in a batch of lemon cakes. In both cases, the suspected means mirrored Branwell's almost exactly. Food poisoned in minute doses, hidden in sweet, ordinary things. Neither case ever resulted in a conviction. No solid links were established, but an internal memo circulated through the London and regional police bureaus with the heading, "R.E. Possibility of itinerant poisoner mo consistent with Lupin Street, Branwell, pattern." There was even speculation, unconfirmed, that Miss Cecily Morvan had been sighted in Liverpool under a different name, working as a domestic cook. But the trail went cold again. Changing the rules. While the case remained legally unresolved, it sparked something far more tangible in public life: policy reform. In 1898, Parliament passed new food safety legislation under the Revised Sale of Food and Drugs Act, which required labeling and tracking of baking ingredients at all commercial food establishments, mandatory supplier documentation for all chemical additives, including baking powders and cream of tartar, random kitchen inspections, particularly in shops selling both fresh food and prepared goods. Though these rules were sparked by several factors, Branwell's was cited directly in internal policy meetings. Inspector Gray, who quietly retired 2 years later, would later say in a private letter, "It is a strange justice, that a crime without a suspect, without a trial, without a sentence should still leave behind a cleaner, save for London." But the memory of the case lingered. The widow's napkin. Mrs. Pritchard's family kept the cloth napkin she had been holding on the day she died. It had been neatly folded, hiding the final bite of her cherry scone. When her granddaughter, aged 7 at the time, asked why the bite had been left behind, her mother reportedly answered, "Because she knew something wasn't right, but she didn't want to say it out loud." That image, the final bite, folded and hidden, became symbolic in whispered stories of the Branwell poisonings. A warning, perhaps, or an accusation never spoken. Reflections in teacups. In retrospect, the tea shop poisonings weren't remarkable because of their scale. They weren't serial killings, nor mass panic crimes. There were no manifestos or anonymous threats. They were remarkable because they violated something deeper: the safety of ritual, the trust in the everyday. A warm room, a cup of tea, A small act of kindness from a stranger across a linen-covered table. To destroy that trust required no violence, no shouting. Just a hand in a kitchen, a tin on a shelf, a final silent bite left uneaten. Story 5. The Gaslight Burglaries. It began with a sound that wasn't heard. On a fog-drenched October morning in 1883, Mr. Bernard Rudge, a solicitor residing in the respectable borough of Maida Vale, awoke to find his study empty. A silver inkwell, 2 gilt-edged ledgers, a drawer of client correspondence gone. His wife's brooch had vanished from the mantel, and strangest of all, the front door was still locked from the inside. There was no shattered glass, no broken lock, no sign of forced entry. Just silence. The police, summoned with haste, found no immediate answers. Inspector Peter Harborne, who arrived from Paddington Station, described it as the most polite burglary I've ever had the displeasure of witnessing. Nothing was ransacked. The tea tray had been left undisturbed. Even the family dog hadn't barked. Rudge's case would have seemed an oddity and outlier if it hadn't happened again, and again, and again. Within 6 months, 9 households across West London from Notting Hill to Bayswater had reported similar incidents. Objects missing, rooms undisturbed, windows intact and locks untouched. What tied them all together? They occurred at night. They happened during winter. And they all involved homes lit by gaslight. Thus began the file at Scotland Yard, labeled simply, "The Gaslight Burglaries." The illusion of safety. In the late 19th century, gaslight was a symbol of modernity. It transformed London's evenings, bringing warmth and safety into drawing rooms and hallways. It was cleaner than candles, brighter than oil, and made the city's long, dark nights feel just a little less dangerous. But what few residents understood was that the system itself, pipes, valves, vents, could be tampered with. Inspector Harborne suspected early on that the burglar was not entering forcibly, but rather quietly disabling the occupants. At first, this idea was dismissed. Surely no criminal could control a home's gas supply. But then came the incident at Mr. Alton Greaves's residence on Ladbroke Terrace. Mr. Greaves, an amateur photographer, had installed a barograph in his study to track air pressure. On the morning after a burglary, the device showed a significant drop in oxygen levels overnight, far more than what gaslight alone could cause. He hadn't been burgled. He had been sedated. A breath too deep. The breakthrough came in January 1884, when a burglary attempt failed. Mrs. Caroline Mills, a governess in Kensington, awoke during the night to a severe headache and a strange buzzing in her ears. She stumbled to her window and threw it open. The next morning, she discovered that several drawers had been opened and her jewelry box was missing. Police found no signs of forced entry, but they did find scrape marks near the external gas valve in the alley behind the home. This time there was something new, a handprint, smudged in soot on the brick beside the valve. Forensics being primitive, no identification could be made, but it was enough to confirm what Harborne suspected. The intruder was manipulating gas flow into homes flooding bedrooms with just enough to dull awareness, without triggering the full stench that would wake the victims. It was chemical burglary, carried out by someone with knowledge of gas systems. That's when Harborne began tracking former gas company employees. The list of shadows. Over the next several weeks, a pattern emerged. All homes burgled had external gas mains accessible from side alleys or cold drops. All homes were within 1 mile of the West London gasworks. And in each case, victims reported either drowsiness before bed or waking late and confused. Among the former employees under scrutiny was one Albert Danning, dismissed 2 years earlier for unauthorized side work involving gas line installations. Danning had no fixed address, but had once rented a room in Bayswater. Gray, digging through Gasworks termination records, discovered that Danning had worked specifically with line testing and valve calibration rolls that would give him the precise knowledge needed to adjust pressure just enough to render a household vulnerable without alerting them. But Danning had vanished, and the burglaries continued. A city asleep. By the spring of 1884, 15 cases had been reported. In every instance, the scene was the same. Valuables missing. No visible signs of entry. Occupants left disoriented, often with splitting headaches or vivid, confused dreams. What began as a crime of objects became a crime of psychology. People grew anxious. Sleeping with the gas on once a comfort became a source of fear. Newspapers dubbed the intruder the phantom under pressure. One editorial warned, "What good is a locked door when a man can steal your breath, your wakefulness, your very night, and never once make a sound?" For Inspector Harborne, the hunt became personal. He tracked gas reports, inspected old pipeline maps, and visited second-hand shops where stolen goods might reappear. But no fences turned up anything matching the missing items. It seemed the burglar didn't sell what he stole. He kept it. Why? That's what the police were desperate to know. And then came the turning point. A burglary that failed not because of luck, but because someone was watching. So we end this section with a question. What happens when a criminal outsmarts both locks and lungs until someone finally stays awake long enough to see him come through the shadows? In the next section, we'll follow the failed burglary that exposed the gaslight burglar's techniques, the strange personal archive discovered in a hidden room, and how obsession not greed may have driven one of London's most unsettling burglars. The burglary on Upper Phillimore Gardens was supposed to go like all the others. It was a large home, gaslit, and owned by an elderly bachelor named Mr. Lionel Kestrel, a retired civil engineer known for keeping rigid evening habits and an extensive collection of antique clocks. But what the burglar did not know was that Mr. Kestrel, increasingly paranoid after reading about the gaslight burglaries in the Times, had not been sleeping in his bedroom. He had taken to spending nights in his study, behind a locked door, with the window cracked open and a notebook on his lap. He slept in short stretches, rising each hour to jot down the time, the temperature, and most importantly, the scent of the air. It was during one such half-waking check, just after 2:15 a.m., that he noticed it, a low hiss from the corridor wall like a pipe purging slowly. And then the footsteps soft, measured, deliberate. Mr. Kestrel did not scream. He sat still. When the footsteps moved past the study door toward the drawing room, he slid a metal pin into the lock and opened the window wider to flush the room of air. When morning came, the drawing room had been emptied of silver trinkets and the smaller of two grandfather clocks. But for the first time, the burglar had left behind clear evidence. A tool mark on the outside valve box, a partial footprint in the damp mud by the coal chute, and most tellingly, a torn scrap of cloth snagged on a nail near the cellar window, a piece of brown serge fabric, cut clean through. It would become the first thread, unraveling one of the most bizarre burglaries in Victorian memory. A familiar stitch. Scotland Yard's forensic methods in 1884 were limited, but not non-existent. The torn cloth was analyzed by Inspector Harborne's assistant, Constable Ainsley, who had prior experience in textile work. He determined that the material was standard-issue Gasworks uniform fabric, issued between 1878 and 1882. The stitching was amateur repaired by hand, not machine, suggesting the garment had been modified or maintained by someone outside the system. Using old payroll and inventory records from the West London Gasworks, Harborne compiled a list of dismissed employees matching that uniform era. At the top, Albert Danning. Weeks passed without new burglaries. But then, in late June 1884, An apprentice chimney sweep named Wilton Bagg reported something odd while working near Paddington Basin. In the upper floor of an abandoned boarding house condemned due to cracked gas lines, he discovered a locked interior room sealed with scrap wood and rope. The building was due for demolition, but curiosity got the better of him. What Bagg found behind that door would explain everything. The Archive of Night. Inside the room was no bed, no hearth, no food, just shelves. Shelves stacked with items, a brooch, a silver salt spoon, a brass bell, a child's tin whistle, all catalogued, all clean, all wrapped in oilcloth. In the corner was an air valve control wheel, disconnected but attached to a homemade frame clearly used for practice. Against the far wall sat a board of London maps, each dotted with pins, notations, and pressure readings. And in the center of the room sat a notebook, labeled only. Winds Without Knocking. It was a journal, a meticulous record of each burglary. But what stunned Harborne most was this. The notes made no mention of resale, no mention of value. Instead, they documented the sensation of silence, the timing of gas flow, and most unsettling of all descriptions of the victim sleeping. One entry read, June 3, woman turned once, gasped but did not wake, took 3 steps to clear floorboard without sound, clock ticked, took thimble, perfect. This was not greed. It was artistry. The phantom in flesh. 2 nights later, Albert Danning was finally apprehended near Camden, emerging from a disused servant's entrance at the rear of a home in Euston Square. He was found carrying a gas valve spanner, a set of soft leather shoes, and a folded cloth containing a single watch fob marked with the initials LK, Lionel Kestrel. He offered no resistance. When questioned, he was unusually cooperative, almost proud. His statement to Inspector Harborne, recorded verbatim. I never broke in, I entered like air. They left the gas burning, I simply made it my own. They were asleep, I took nothing they'd miss. When asked why he never sold the stolen items, Danning replied, selling would have made it theft. I kept them to prove it could be done. Trial and sentence. The case of the Crown versus Albert Danning became an unlikely courtroom curiosity. The press dubbed him the Gaslight Ghost and described his crimes with an uncomfortable mixture of awe and fear. He was found guilty on 9 counts of burglary, with sentence enhancements for use of disabling methods. The judge described his method as deliberate, calculated, and dangerously clever. He was sentenced to 15 years in Wandsworth Prison. And yet, even in the judge's summation, there was a tone of reluctant admiration. It is not that Mr. Danning wished to steal, but that he wished to be unseen. He desired not possessions, but to outwit the waking world. So we are left with this: a man who weaponized modern comfort, a burglar who learned not how to pick locks, but how to manipulate air, and a city forced to ask whether its silence meant security or invitation. When Albert Danning was sentenced in the summer of 1884, few in the courtroom celebrated. There were no jeers from the public gallery, no cheers from victims or families. Even the presiding judge, normally stern in cases of domestic intrusion, passed sentence with a voice so quiet it was nearly lost under the murmur of the spectators. Because Danning wasn't like other criminals. He hadn't broken locks or windows. He hadn't left destruction in his wake. There were no violent threats, no bloody aftermaths, no screaming victims. Instead, his crimes forced the people of London to consider something far more disturbing: that danger could arrive without noise and vanish without trace. The panic that followed. Following Danning's conviction, a brief but intense public panic set in. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Is the air still ours?" "Silent intrusion, can you hear the crime?" "London's homes at risk, police urge gas valve checks." Homeowners across the city began requesting external lock covers for gas valves and chained window fasteners, even in upper-floor bedrooms. Letters to editors called for daylight-only gas usage. Some residents demanded new municipal legislation to restrict access to external gas lines entirely. This wasn't a panic rooted in violence, it was a fear of violation without awareness. For a short time, gas itself became suspect. Shifts in infrastructure. The West London gasworks, already under scrutiny for employee misconduct, began implementing sweeping changes. Workers were issued new uniform and identification tags. Employees were banned from taking tools off-site. External valve access boxes were sealed with serial-numbered metal bands, only to be opened with manager approval. And most notably, a policy was instituted requiring that all residential line work be done in pairs, never by a single technician. Homeowners, too, were advised to ventilate bedrooms, to avoid sleeping with gas lamps burning overnight, and to monitor for signs of tampering on their exterior fixtures. These precautions, in large part, did not exist before Danning. He hadn't just stolen objects, he had altered how London slept. The Forgotten Archive. Danning's collection of stolen goods, numbering over 120 items, was held by Scotland Yard until 1889. Then, in accordance with property reclamation policies, items not matched to victims were quietly auctioned or destroyed. One notable exception was the notebook he titled Wins Without Knocking. A detective clerk, fascinated by its contents, kept it in a personal drawer long after the case had closed. It now resides in the archives of the Metropolitan Police Historical Collection, rarely displayed, but occasionally cited by criminal psychologists as an early example of compulsive trespass behavior. The notebook contains no mention of money, nor any discussion of fence contacts or profits. It is filled instead with pages of diagrams, notes on sound frequencies, and meticulous floor plans. What Danning seemed to want more than wealth was something else entirely: to be present and unremembered. The man behind the silence. Albert Danning served 11 years of his 15-year sentence. Released in 1895 for good behavior, he was reportedly offered work as a groundskeeper on a rural estate in Sussex. After that, no records exist. No death certificate, no further arrests, no published interviews. He simply vanished ironically, in keeping with his life's peculiar pursuit. Rumors emerged over the years. Some claimed he went mad and died in an asylum. Others said he emigrated to New Zealand and changed his name. But the most popular story, the one passed between constables and chimney sweeps and night porters, was that he returned to London and simply watched. They said that if your gaslight flickered twice before midnight, it meant he had walked by. If your dog barked at an empty hallway, he was near. He wasn't a thief anymore, just a phantom revisiting old paths. Of course, there's no evidence for any of this. But in quiet London homes, where the walls hissed with hidden flames, the idea stuck. Legacy of a quiet crime. Today, the idea of gaslight burglary seems quaint, something out of fiction. But in 1884, it exposed a set of truths that still resonate. That modern comforts can become modern vulnerabilities. That invisibility is not just a technical trick, but a psychological weapon. And that not all crimes are committed for gain. Some are born of obsession, control, and the hunger to move unseen. In the end, Danning's legacy was not what he took, but what he left behind. A city more cautious, a public more watchful, and a phrase to be like the gaslight burglar that would, for a time, come to mean to slip through the cracks before anyone knows you were there. Story 6. The Forger Who Preferred Postage Stamps. In a London attic in 1891, a postman named Alfred Bertram noticed something strange about a letter. Not the envelope itself, it bore a standard Queen Victoria stamp and a modest return address from Kent, but the texture. It felt waxy, almost too smooth. Bertram had handled thousands of letters. This one, he later recalled, felt like it had been sealed by sleight of hand. He didn't open it, of course, but when he handed it over at the Eastgate sorting office, the clerk there, Mr. Chambers, noticed something even stranger. The postmark was 3 days in the future. It was an anomaly no one could explain. The letter was sent for inspection. When examined under magnification, the stamp's microprinting revealed flaws almost imperceptible to the naked eye. A Q in Queen curled differently, a missing crossbar on a T, and the perforations along the edge were inconsistent. The letter bore a counterfeit stamp, expertly rendered and pasted onto real correspondence. But it wasn't a one-off. It was the first public trace of a hidden, elegant crime that had already spanned more than a decade and had cost the Royal Mail an estimated £4,000 in lost revenue, a fortune in the 1890s. The trail would lead to a man known only by a pseudonym at first, the Lavender Forger. A quiet crime repeated. Stamp forgery is rarely considered glamorous, even in the annals of true crime. It lacks the blood and boldness of burglary, the shock of murder. But to the postal authorities in late Victorian England, it was treasonous. Stamps weren't just tokens of postage, they were miniature symbols of royal authority. To forge, one was to defraud the crown. The Lavender Forger was named for the distinctive ink used on early counterfeit stamps, deep violet, almost indistinguishable from the real Queen Victoria lilac issues. It had just a hint more blue, visible only when the light caught it at an angle. What made the forgeries so disturbing was their precision. These weren't crude copies made to defraud commoners. They were high-quality facsimiles used selectively, often on letters sent between middle-class or professional addresses. The implication was chilling. Someone was targeting the system from within. Discovery by philatelists. Curiously, the Lavender Forger was first suspected not by law enforcement, but by stamp collectors. In early 1892, a wealthy printer named Horace Grieve, who specialized in Queen Victoria issues, noticed an odd trend. Several stamps he had acquired through estate sales had anomalous gum glue on the back, slightly grainy and slow to moisten. Grieve brought this to the attention of George Kennerly, a postal historian, who verified that the plate lines on the forgeries were identical to genuine stamps, but the plate flaws were artificially introduced. Someone wasn't copying stamps. They were creating fake versions of real printing plates, with slight variations, to evade detection by automated inspection. These weren't hobbyists or amateurs. This was the work of a trained engraver. Hidden in the ink itself, lavender, lilac, violet, became central to the case. At the behest of the General Post Office, samples were sent to King's College Chemistry Department. There, a young researcher named Edwin Rollo confirmed something remarkable. The ink used in the fake stamps contained a compound not found in official formulations, a trace mineral dye called ultramarine pyrolith, common in fine artist pigments, but not postal issue ink. It narrowed the suspect pool considerably. The Postal Service cross-referenced known artists, engravers, and chemical printers who had access to these materials. One name appeared in 3 of their lists: a former bookplate designer turned commercial printer in Lambeth, Mr. Lionel Weatherby, the man with the tiny press. Weatherby was not the typical criminal. In fact, he wasn't known as a criminal at all. He ran a quiet printing business that mostly produced custom stationery, menus, and programs for amateur theater productions. But a search of his records revealed that he had once held a short-term contract with the Inland Revenue Office, designing ornamental stamps for tax certificates. It gave him exactly what investigators feared: access to authentic printing equipment, template designs, and the techniques to replicate them. When a plainclothes agent visited Weatherby's shop under the pretense of ordering custom wedding invitations, he noticed a small platen press tucked in a back corner. Weatherby said it hadn't worked in years, but its inking plate still held a faint violet sheen. The tip that broke the case. The break came when a disgruntled apprentice, dismissed from Weatherby's service for clumsiness with typesetting, contacted police. He claimed his former employer worked late into the night, producing tiny sheets no one was allowed to see. Once he had glimpsed a page of Queen's faces, he said, but in the wrong color. Based on this testimony, the Metropolitan Police obtained a warrant. The raid on Weatherby's shop revealed a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, filled with blank stamp paper, homemade perforation guides, lavender dye packets, and over 600 counterfeit stamps, each mounted on real correspondence, addressed and ready. But none had been mailed, because Weatherby wasn't trying to profit in the usual way. He was testing how long he could evade detection. And so we end this first section with a peculiar question. What kind of criminal spends years mastering miniature forgeries, only to hoard them like trophies? In the next section, we'll uncover Weatherby's psychological profile, his quiet obsession with imperial imagery, and how the Royal Mail tried to suppress public knowledge of the crime entirely. When the Metropolitan Police finally arrested Lionel Weatherby in April of 1892, the arresting officers found him in his back room, hunched over a jeweler's magnifier, trimming perforations from a sheet of what appeared to be postage stamps. He did not deny what he was doing. What he asked, however, puzzled the constables. Do they look real to you, honestly now if you didn't know? It was not the voice of a man caught in the act. It was the voice of a man asking for validation, an artist seeking critique. And indeed, that's how Weatherby saw himself, not as a forger, but as a perfectionist, a technician, someone preserving a standard that the Crown had, in his opinion, begun to neglect. The months that followed would uncover a mind not driven by money, but by aesthetic defiance, social resentment, and a peculiar obsession with the symbolism of postage stamps themselves. The Room of Paper Faces. Investigators cataloged 712 counterfeit stamps from Weatherby's hidden inventory. But more unusual were the scrapbooks. He had created 9 in total. Each volume carefully preserved a variety of forged stamp designs, annotated in the margins with notes like plate offset improved, ultramarine too strong at midday light, better shadows under Queen's eye. In one volume, he had pasted 2 columns of stamps, one genuine, one forged, and challenged himself to spot the difference in under 5 seconds. In some cases, even the inspectors failed. There were also trial stamps, experimental designs he'd invented based on Victorian iconography. Stamps bearing lions, Britannia, and angels, all rendered in shades of violet, blue, or crimson. They were never intended for circulation. They were made for the joy of precision. This was no criminal pressing duplicates for fraud. This was a man building a private museum to himself. The artist as saboteur. Psychologists of the time had no formal diagnosis for men like Weatherby, but in later court proceedings, the Crown prosecutor described him as a savant saboteur, someone who did not steal from the system, but recreated it in parody. The oddest fact of the case was this: Weatherby never spent a single forged stamp. Yes, his equipment was capable of mass duplication. Yes, he tested real letters with counterfeit stamps, as seen in his backroom correspondences. But not one had ever been sent. Every envelope in his hidden cache was blank inside. This wasn't theft, it was simulation. When asked in court why he never used the stamps to send real letters, Weatherby replied, "To use them would be to admit they weren't real. As long as they stayed in the drawer, they remained perfect. This answer flummoxed even the magistrate. The inkwell of resentment. Testimony from Weatherby's former apprentice shed more light on his motivations. According to the young man, Weatherby often ranted about the decline of design standards in modern stamps. He said the Queen's face had lost its sharpness, that the dyes were cheap now, that the soul of the empire had been reduced to poor printing. Weatherby, it seemed, regarded his forgeries as restorative, as if he were correcting a cultural lapse. He was a man of limited means, working in a profession increasingly dominated by larger printing firms. He had lost several government contracts, and according to neighbors, felt embittered by his fading reputation. Forgery for him became a protest in miniature. The courtroom performance. The trial, held at the Old Bailey in October 1892, attracted little public attention. There were no thrilling revelations, no injured victims. The newspapers mostly buried the story beneath more salacious headlines. But within the courtroom, something curious occurred. Weatherby represented himself. In precise language and with remarkable poise, he argued that what he had done was not criminal forgery, but unauthorized artistic recreation. He pointed out that no financial harm had come to the crown, that none of the stamps had entered public circulation, and that he had sold nothing. Theft requires gain, he told the court. I gained only solitude. The judge was unmoved. Weatherby was convicted on 3 counts of intent to defraud, and 6 counts of possessing tools for the purpose of forgery. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, to be served at Pentonville. What was hidden never vanished. The sentence was light, but the ripple effect was not. Following the case, the Royal Mail quietly introduced a new ink formula with added luminescent compounds, intended to make future forgery more difficult. They also stopped issuing monochrome violet stamps, the very color that had become Weatherby's signature. It was as if the lavender forger had soured the color itself. Philatelists, meanwhile, became obsessed with tracking down surviving Weatherby forgeries. Though most had been confiscated, rumors persisted that a handful had made it into the collector's market. To this day, no more than 11 verified Weatherby stamps are believed to exist in private hands. Each is worth thousands. But none bear a price tag as peculiar as the one Weatherby himself once scribbled in his scrapbook. Perfection cannot be sold, only imitated. So we end this section with a strange reflection. Was Lionel Weatherby a criminal, a craftsman, or a lonely man trying to stamp his mark literally on a world that no longer noticed him? In the final section, we'll explore how the lavender forger influenced anti-counterfeiting measures, inspired a generation of philatelists, and how one final letter sent after his death raised questions about whether his hand had ever truly stopped working. Lionel Weatherby was released from Pentonville Prison in the spring of 1896. He was thinner, quieter, and as one clerk put it, seemed less interested in ink than in life. He walked with a slight stoop and carried only one possession, a worn satchel containing his last sketchpad, confiscated upon his arrest and returned with his release. What he did after leaving prison is largely unrecorded. The printing shop in Lambeth had been shuttered. His former apprentice had moved on, and Weatherby himself had no family to speak of. But what is known, what cannot be dismissed, is that in the months following his release, dozens of counterfeit stamps began appearing again. Not in bulk, not in profit-driven waves, but singularly, precisely, and always in the same odd fashion. One letter, one forged stamp, always addressed to a different stamp dealer, printer, or government office, and each containing only a blank sheet of paper. A phantom's farewell. At first, the post office assumed copies from Weatherby's earlier stash had simply been lost and were now turning up again. But closer inspection revealed small variations in these new forgeries, modern postmarks, new plate flaws, and even subtle design changes to match the updated stamps of the late 1890s. This wasn't an old stash being depleted. It was new work. Yet when Weatherby was questioned briefly, in mid-1897, he denied everything. "My eyes aren't what they were," he told the agent flatly. "Besides, I haven't got the hands for curves anymore." The agent believed him, or wanted to. Weatherby died less than a year later, in April of 1898, from bronchial pneumonia. He was 51. He died alone in a boarding house in Clerkenwell and left no will. The posthumous letter. 2 weeks after Weatherby's death, a peculiar envelope arrived at the British Museum's philately department, addressed to curator Dr. Elbridge Thorpe. The envelope bore a stamp so finely made, even Thorpe himself assumed it was real until he recognized a minute detail. Queen Victoria's earring was slightly different. It was a tiny artist's brush, visible only under magnification. Inside the envelope was a folded page, blank, but for a sentence written in faint lavender ink. Even the Queen must be redrawn from time to time. The museum did not disclose this publicly, but among stamp experts, the letter became legend, the lavender forger's final flourish. And no one could say for sure if he had mailed it before his death, or if someone else, perhaps a student, a friend, or a like-minded admirer, had continued his craft in tribute. Lingering effects. Weatherby's story faded quickly from the public press. It was not the kind of scandal that lingered: no blood, no bodies, no lost fortunes. But within the stamp collecting community, he became something of a myth. His techniques were studied. His counterfeits became coveted. And his philosophy that perfection mattered more than legality earned him both reverence and revulsion. Even today, forensic philatelists cite Weatherby's forgeries as the gold standard in 19th century counterfeit production. His tools, recovered from the Lambeth workshop, are housed in a restricted access archive at the Royal Mail Museum. And his influence lived on in curious ways. In the design of security watermarks, first introduced in 1904, in the ban on single-color designs for official stamps in early 20th century England, and in the cultural awareness that a stamp was not just a sticker, but a sovereign seal. A lasting impression. Weatherby wasn't seeking riches. He didn't desire acclaim. And he certainly wasn't trying to bring down the postal system. What he wanted, what he insisted upon, was beauty in bureaucracy. He looked at mass-produced stamps and saw apathy. He forged not to deceive, but to correct. To him, forging a better stamp was not a crime, it was a moral gesture. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Because it means the lavender forger didn't commit his crime out of necessity or greed. He did it because he thought he was right.